questions on the AP exam, certainly one of the longest ones. Rest of them should be pretty straightforward. So let's take a look at number 3. A crossword puzzle grid is a two-dimensional rectangular array of black and white squares, and we have to use the crossword labeling rule here. The idea is that we are going to label something if it's on the top row, or it's on the leftmost column, or if it's directly below a black square, or if it's directly to the right of a black square. So these are the 4 different situations where a number is going to get labeled. And we're going to be starting at 1, and we're going to be going from left to right and top to bottom. So our objective here is to work with this square class. This square class has a constructor which we don't care how it works, but we're going to be creating square objects. This is going to be one square of the crossword puzzle, and it's going to keep track of whether or not it's black, and if it has a number. Keep in mind that if it doesn't have a number, as we'll see later, we're going to put a 0 in there. So what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to go top down, left to right, given some array of black squares, which is just Boolean, yes it's black or no it's not. We're going to have to create a puzzle. But before we do that, we have to come up with this private helper method to be labeled, which tells us if the conditions are right for this to be one of the blocks that are labeled. This is really going to help us when we have to do our constructor. So remember the rules that we talked about if something's going to be labeled. So the first thing I need to know is if it's black, then I want to make sure that it's not labeled. So if black squares sub R sub C, if that's true, so I want to see if it's black, then return false. So if that ends up being a black square, then I want to return false. Otherwise, now I need to check the positioning. So if R is equal to 0 or C is equal to 0, then we want to return true. Because as we said, as long as it's on the top row or that leftmost column, all of those blocks, as long as they're not black, they're going to get a number. So if that's true, then we want to return true. So once we're sure about that, now I want to see, okay, is there a black box to the left, or is there a black box on top? In any of those situations, we are going to number, and those are the only situations where we're going to get around to numbering it. So if I get to this step, if I get to this line in my code, then I know I'm not on the first row, and so I can actually check R minus 1. So I can say if black squares sub R minus 1 C, then return true. And also if I get to this row of my code, then I know that C can't be 0, so I can check the column as well. So if black squares sub R sub C minus 1, then return true. Now these are the only conditions that we have where we're going to be putting a number. So if I reach this line of my code, I've reached all of the possible true conditions, so I just want to go ahead and say return false. So what I'm doing is I'm checking, is it black? If it's black, then get rid of it. Return false. If the row is 0 or the column is 0, then that's good. We're on the first row or the first column. Yes, it's a numberable block. If the spot before it or the spot above, the spot above it or the spot before it to the left of it is black, then we're going to say we can put a number there. But if none of those cases are true, if we get all the way down to this line of code, then we're going to go ahead and return false. So now that we've got that done, now we're ready to look at the constructor for our crossword puzzle. So the first thing I have to do is I have to keep track of what number is going to be in that spot. And keep in mind, when I go back to my original crossword puzzle, the very first number I have is 1. So I'm going to keep track of that number. So I'm going to say int num is 1. And then what I need to do is also create a puzzle. Keep in mind that my puzzle is going to have an array of squares. I need to make sure that I fill that up. So I need to say puzzle gets new array of squares, and it's going to be of a certain number of rows and a certain number of columns. So I've got int num equals 1. I'm actually going to make this a comma, and I'm going to say r, or rows, gets black squares dot length, and I'm going to say calls is going to get black squares sub 0 dot length. So what this is going to do is this is going to get the number of rows and columns as a variable, so I'm not going to have to keep calling on them. So when I do my constructor, I'm going to have a new square of size rows and of columns calls. So that's going to create an array of those. Now all I have to do is fill up this puzzle. And remember that I'm supposed to fill it up left to right, top to bottom. So the first row, then the second row, then the third row, starting at column 0 and going to the last calls. So when I do my loop, I want to make sure I do my first row first. So int r gets 0, r is less than rows, r plus plus, for int c gets 0, c is less than calls, c plus plus. And so now I'm ready to go through and figure out if this is going to be a labeled spot. So if to be labeled, the particular row, column, and pass the black squares to it. So if this needs to be labeled, then I want to say that puzzle at spot RC is going to get a new square with the truth value of black squares, which means if it's to be labeled, it must be a white square. So this is going to end up being true. Or excuse me, not true, false. Horrible, bad, Mr. Potter. Notice that this is Boolean is black. If I'm going to label it, then no. So it's going to be new square with the first parameter false, and the second parameter is going to be num, starting at position 1, and then num plus plus. So if it's going to be labeled, I need to do both of those things. If it's not going to be labeled, then I still need to fill it, but I need to fill it with whatever spot it is. In other words, what it is in the black squares matrix, but my num is going to be 0. So I'm going to say puzzle of RC is going to get a new square, and I'm going to ask black squares row R, column C, what it should be. Notice that that's going to give me a Boolean value, which will be the first parameter in our constructor for square. And then I'm also going to give it a 0. And that's all I'm going to need for my loop and for my method. So this determines whether or not a particular block is going to be labeled, and then every element in that crossword puzzle uses that as a helper method. So again, we're talking about going through, this is our traversal of matrix, which has been a traditional question on the AP exam.